Captain Jonathan Park, known to most as Jax, had never been particularly impressed by the vastness of space. Maybe it was the view out the window of his battered spacecraft, the Dandelion, or maybe it was the incessant hum of the ship's AI, Bernice, but space, to Jax, always seemed too quiet. Too vast. It was a long stretch between stars, and even longer between moments of meaning. He'd long since stopped caring about the weight of the universe pressing down on him. After all, he wasn't a philosopher or a scientist, he was an astronaut, trained to get things done and return home. Ideally without any undue drama. The immediate drama on his mind, though, was much more immediate, the dwindling supply of potato chips in his small galley. It wasn't so much that he was hungry, though that was true. It was more the fact that his last bag of crisps had developed an irritating crease in the corner, one that prevented him from getting a good grab on the last few crumbs without a fight. You would think, he mused, that in space, one could avoid the laws of physics at least long enough to enjoy a snack in peace. Bernice's voice, dry as always, almost sarcastic, interrupted his snack battle. Captain Park, we have an incoming transmission from Earth. The government is on the line. Jack sighed dramatically and dropped the half-crushed bag of chips onto the table. Great, he muttered. Just when I was getting into my chips. Let me guess, the fate of the human race depends on you. Same script, different day. It had been months since he'd last seen Earth, and he didn't particularly miss it. The Earth government had a bad habit of throwing the weight of the universe onto his shoulders just as he was getting into his routine. But this was his routine, damn it, and no one, especially not some bureaucrat in a suit, was going to tell him how to run his life. The image flickered onto his screen. Dr. Angela Harper, head of the Temporal Exploration Initiative, stared back at him from the other side of the transmission, her face set in that classic, "we're in trouble, and only you can save us" expression. It was the look that had launched 1,000 astronauts, and every time he saw it, Jax's inner eye rolled. Captain Park, Dr. Harper said, cutting straight to the chase, we've got a situation. Something has happened in the outer reaches of the solar system, something big. We need you to investigate. We need you to get there before things get worse. Jax narrowed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. And what exactly am I dealing with here? Harper's face tightened. We've identified a series of anomalies, black holes, but not like any we've seen before. They're different. They're creating distortions in time and space. We believe they may be artificially created. You're the only one close enough to reach them. Jax blinked, taken aback. Wait, you're telling me there's some kind of man-made black holes out there, and you want me to go investigate? Harper nodded grimly. Yes. And it gets worse, Captain. These black holes are active. They're not just sucking in matter, they're warping time itself. We've been unable to get any solid data, but reports are coming in from stations near the anomalies saying that time is unpredictable. It's not just localized to the black holes, either. Some reports say the past and future are mixing together. Jax's mind was spinning. Time travel was one thing, but this? This was a whole new level of madness. You want me to investigate some interdimensional rift created by, what? Alien scientists? Future humans with too much time on their hands? Not exactly, Harper said, her voice a little too quiet. We think it's a future civilization, one that's figured out a way to manipulate time. They're experimenting with it. But their experiments are threatening the stability of the entire space-time continuum. Jax glanced at his potato chips, the sarcasm practically bleeding out of him. Right. So what you're telling me is that some future version of humanity has decided to play God with time, and now I have to go clean up the mess. Dr. Harper sighed. I don't expect you to understand right away. But I need you to go to the outer reaches of the system. We've identified a cluster of anomalies near Jupiter's moons. They're growing. If they continue to expand, it could spell disaster for the entire galaxy. Jack stood up from his chair, straightening his jumpsuit with an exaggerated stretch. All right. You know I don't turn down a job. Even if it's some future-hopping time-warping mess. But if I come back and Earth's been replaced by a bunch of talking lizards or something, I'm going to be really pissed. You're the best we've got, Captain Park, Harper said, cutting the transmission off. Jax rolled his eyes and slumped back into his chair. Sure. Best. That's what they always say. The Dandelion was an old ship, a patched-up relic from the previous century. Jax loved it. It was small, efficient, and didn't try to impress anyone. When it came to missions like this, it was just the right kind of no-nonsense tool for the job. Well, that, and it had a decent coffee machine, which was more than he could say for most military crafts. The AI, Bernice, hummed quietly as they hurtled toward the anomaly cluster. She wasn't much for idle chit-chat, which suited Jax just fine. He didn't need to hear her comments about his life choices or how he really should have checked the calibration on the oxygen scrubbers last week. Captain Park, Bernice interrupted his thoughts, her voice cutting through the silence. We are approaching the first anomaly. I recommend scanning the area for any changes in spacetime. Jax nodded, tapping the control panel. Yeah. On it. He initiated the scan, and the display flickered to life. A small patch of space just beyond Jupiter's moons was showing an irregular distortion, as if someone had pressed their thumb on the fabric of time. It was subtle at first, but the longer Jack stared, the more the anomaly began to pulse an almost rhythmic blink, like the stutter of a faulty light bulb. Well, that's not ominous at all, Jax muttered under his breath. He set the Dandelion on course for the anomaly, trying not to think too hard about what it might mean. As they approached the event horizon of the first black hole, Jax couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The Dandelion had been through a lot too much, some might say, but this was different. There was a palpable sense of something wrong. That he initiated the probe, sending it into the black hole with a quiet prayer that it would at least come back in one piece. The probe shot into the vortex, disappearing from sight. Seconds later, it blinked back into existence on his monitor. But something had changed. The data was all scrambled. The probe's sensors had picked up some truly bizarre reading. Spacetime around the black hole was shifting in ways Jax couldn't even begin to explain. Objects that were once aged and weathered appeared pristine, while other objects were suddenly older than they had any right to be. A moon nearby, one Jax had known to be an ancient, pockmarked wasteland, was now entirely smooth, as if it had been made yesterday. Jax's fingers hovered over the console, unsure of what he was seeing. He reran the scan, checking the readings again. No matter how many times he did it, the data came out the same. Reality was being bent and warped. Not by a physical force, but by something much more complex. Bernice, get me Dr. Wu, Jax ordered. The AI complied, and within seconds, Dr. Wu's face appeared on the screen. Captain Park, have you reached the anomaly? She asked, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. Yeah, and it's as freaky as you described. Time's getting jacked up out here. The probe just came back with some weird data. A moon nearby is suddenly looking, well, brand new. Like, polished clean. Dr. Wu's brow furrowed. That's exactly what we're seeing in other regions. Time's being rewritten, Captain. And not in a natural way. It's like someone or something is manually editing history. Jax leaned back in his chair, chewing on that. So you're telling me that whatever's creating these black holes is messing with history itself? They're trying to rewrite the past? Yes, Dr. Wu confirmed. And if they succeed, we won't just lose the future. We'll lose the present. Time itself is beginning to unravel. We need to find the source of these anomalies before it's too late. Jax didn't need to hear any more. He was already en route, his course locked on the coordinates Dr. Wu had sent him. He pushed the Dandelion faster, the engine whining in protest as the ship accelerated toward the first anomaly. The space between Jupiter and its moons had always been a silent void, but now, it felt charged like the calm before a storm. Something was out there, waiting. The problem was, Jax had no idea what. And frankly, that uncertainty gnawed at him more than he'd like to admit. He wasn't scared. Scared wasn't a feeling astronauts were supposed to have, not on this job. But there was something about this that didn't sit right, like there was a part of the universe trying to undo itself, trying to eat away at everything around it. His fingers drummed on the console as the ship glided closer, his eyes glued to the readings coming in. The black hole was still pulsing in front of him, a barely perceptible rhythmic flicker. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, the kind of weight that makes you feel small, makes you realize just how fragile the fabric of reality really is. Then the anomaly flashed. A wave of distortion, brief but intense, rippled through the ship's sensors, making the entire cockpit shudder for a moment. He felt it, his bones vibrating, his gut twisting like it had just been twisted inside a blender. Time itself was shifting, bending around the hole, its shape not even remotely consistent with the laws of physics as he knew them. It was like watching a dream dissolve into fragments. The ship's control systems fought to compensate, stabilizing the trajectory, but the readings were coming in too fast. Too chaotic. Bernice, can you stabilize the sensors? I can't make sense of this, Jack said, his voice tight with frustration. I am doing my best, Captain, Bernice replied, her tone clipped. However, the fluctuations are beyond my capacity to predict. You will need to make your approach carefully. There is too much interference. Jax cursed under his breath. He had no choice but to dive in. He could feel his pulse quicken as the dandelion approached the edge of the anomaly, the black hole now looming larger in the viewport, its form no longer a perfect circle but a jagged, unstable pulse approaching event horizon. Bernice said, right. Jax gritted his teeth and braced himself. He checked the stabilizers one last time before engaging the thrusters to slow the ship down. It wasn't going to be enough to keep them completely steady, but it would help minimize the wild fluctuations he was seeing. That he locked the ship into a stable orbit, keeping just outside the immediate grasp of the black hole. The distortions were worse here, though. Space itself bent in unpredictable directions. The stars around them seemed to shift, disappearing and reappearing in random patterns. The ship's hull groaned under the stress, and Jax heard the sound of something scraping a loose panel or an internal fixture shifting. The constant flickering of lights inside the cockpit only added to the sense of disorientation. There was a blip on his radar, and for a moment, he thought it might have been a ship. A real ship, not just more cosmic debris. Bernice, he called, narrowing his eyes at the screen. Is that a vessel? Is it moving toward us? I am not certain, Captain, Bernice replied. There are too many time distortions to give a reliable readout. Not good enough. Jax didn't hesitate. He grabbed the manual control, overriding the AI's attempts to hold the ship steady. He couldn't risk not knowing what was coming at him. We're going in. Set a course for the anomaly's center. Captain, that may be dangerous. Trust me, I'm aware. The ship lurched as he engaged the thrusters, veering off their orbit and pushing directly into the black hole's gravitational pull. The sensation was like being inside a bad roller coaster, a sudden drop into the unknown, your stomach doing flips, and everything around you warping and twisting as you lost any sense of orientation. Time seemed to blur. Seconds felt like hours. Moments felt like days. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went still. Jax's eyes snapped open, his head pounding as he gripped the controls, trying to regain some sense of control. The dashboard in front of him flickered erratically, but the most pressing thing was the strange, new image that had appeared on the viewport, a station. It wasn't like any station he'd seen before. Its design was sleek, advanced, and foreign. It had the unmistakable look of something built by a civilization far beyond humanity's current capabilities. Bernice, are you seeing this? Jax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I am, Bernice responded, her usual calm replaced by something approaching awe. But the readings, they don't make sense. It's a structure that exists outside of normal spacetime, Captain. It's almost like it shouldn't be here. I think we found it, Jax muttered to himself, shaking his head. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around what he was seeing. Everything about the station felt wrong, like a visual glitch that made no sense in the physical universe. But there it was, undeniably real, floating within the event horizon of the anomaly. Slowly, carefully, Jax maneuvered the dandelion toward the station's docking port. The closer he got, the more surreal everything became. Time wasn't flowing properly around the structure. It twisted and contorted, stretching seconds into minutes and then compressing them into mere milliseconds. It was as though the station existed in multiple timelines at once. Bernice, you'd better start running diagnostics on the temporal field. I don't want any surprises when I step off this ship. Understood, Captain, Bernice replied. But be warned, even brief exposure to these fluctuations could cause permanent temporal displacement. Your safety is not guaranteed. Jax snorted, the irony of it not lost on him. If I wanted safety, I wouldn't have signed up for this job in the first place. He engaged the docking clamps, and the ship shuddered slightly as it latched onto the station's hull. The airlock slid open, and he took a deep breath, steeling himself. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It had become something far more dangerous, a game of cosmic chicken with the future itself. As he stepped off the dandelion and onto the strange metal floor of the station, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints. They weren't human footprints, not exactly. They were too symmetrical, too perfect. They looked like the tracks of something that had walked through this space recently, but the strangest thing was the way the footprints seemed to fade and reappear, as if they had been erased and rewritten multiple times. Jax took a cautious step forward, scanning the surrounding space with his rifle, his heart racing. The air in the station was still, but something heavy seemed to be pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if it was the station's eerie silence or the sheer weight of the impossible situation he found himself in. As he ventured deeper into the station, he began to see more signs of strange activity. Panels along the walls flickered with images, blurred faces, symbols he couldn't understand, flashes of advanced technology that weren't even close to anything he'd ever seen. It was like walking through someone's impossible dream, one that had been pulled from the future and was now spilling into the present. He passed a console, its screens blinking erratically. One of the panels showed a familiar face, Dr. Wu. But she wasn't speaking in real time. Her image was frozen, an image from the past, yet her expression seemed to flicker like someone trying to say something, but the words weren't coming out right. Dr. Wu? Jax whispered, moving closer to the console. Is this am I seeing you from the future? Or is this a memory? Before he could get an answer, the lights flickered again, this time accompanied by a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. A figure appeared in the doorway. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, but it was real, standing there, staring at him, and Jax knew immediately that this was what had been waiting for him. The creators of the anomalies. The architects of time. He raised his rifle instinctively, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts. The figure in the doorway didn't speak in words, but Jax could hear the message, clear and unmistakable, as though it had bypassed his ears and gone straight to his mind. It was as if the thought had been planted there, a foreign intrusion. You are too late. The words were cold, almost mechanical, but they held an unmistakable weight. Jax felt his breath catch in his chest, his grip tightening on the rifle. The thing in front of him wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could have ever expected. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but its features were distorted, its skin a slick, metallic gray that shimmered unnaturally under the dim station lights. It looked like it was made of light and shadows, flickering in and out of focus, like something that didn't belong in this timeline, or any other. Jax tried to steady himself, but his heart was pounding in his chest. What are you?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. The thing had already made its intentions clear. He could feel the pulse of time warping around them, each second stretching and snapping back in unpredictable rhythms. It stepped forward, and as it did, Jax could swear the air itself bent around it. For a split second, he saw an image of the future, his future. His face, older, tired, standing in front of a shattered Earth. A future that seemed impossibly distant, yet all too real. "We are the architects," the figure spoke again, though it didn't move its mouth. The voice filled the room, rattling the very foundation of his mind. "We control the flow of time. We are the future. And you are the past." Jax felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just some alien life form. This wasn't some rogue entity from the farthest reaches of the universe. This was a message from the future. From a time when humanity had learned to manipulate the fabric of reality itself. "Stop," Jax said, his voice hoarse, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of what was happening. He could feel the distortion in his bones now, like he was simultaneously standing in multiple places at once, every moment stretched across 1,000 timelines, but the figure didn't respond. It raised its arm, and the station around them seemed to shudder. The walls warped, their surface flickering between what was real and what wasn't. Jax could barely make sense of the shapes around him. His vision was starting to unravel. For an instant, he saw a flash of a different version of the station, one that looked ancient, decayed, covered in vines and rust. Then it flickered again, and it was pristine, untouched, immaculate. That he wasn't just here. He was everywhere. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen," Jax muttered to himself, his voice feeling distant, like he wasn't sure whether he was the one speaking or not. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Jax could feel the pull of the black hole outside, the same pull that had drawn him here. The thing wasn't just controlling space, it was controlling time itself. Every moment stretched out, fragmented, uncertain. His memories, his thoughts, they were all in flux. "You cannot stop what has begun," the figure whispered again, the thought pressing against his mind like a physical force. "Time is already rewritten. You are too late to change it." Jax's head was spinning. His hands were shaking, the rifle feeling heavy in his grasp. It was all too much. His training had never prepared him for this. There was no protocol for standing in front of a future that had already erased itself. No procedure for facing an enemy that had already won, but something deep inside him refused to give in. This wasn't just about saving himself. This was about saving everyone, his team, the Earth, the future. No matter how fractured it seemed, there had to be a way to fight back. With a breath that steadied his hands, Jax stepped forward. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he wasn't going to let this future overwrite everything. Not without a fight. "You're wrong," Jax said, his voice gaining strength, even as the air around him trembled. "I'm not too late. I'm not going to let you rewrite time." The figure didn't react to his defiance, but the distortion in the air seemed to grow more intense. Jax could feel it, a pressure, a weight on his chest, like the world was closing in on him. He staggered, reaching out for something, anything that could help him make sense of it all. And then, as if from nowhere, the answer came to him. He had one option left. "Bernice, initiate emergency temporal displacement." Jax shouted, his heart pounding in his throat. "Now." There was a brief pause, then Bernice's calm voice came through, almost a whisper against the chaos around him. "Temporal displacement initiated. Estimated time shift, 30 seconds. Jax didn't wait to see what would happen. He just braced himself as the world around him twisted, the station beginning to flicker between timelines again. For one terrifying moment, he thought it wouldn't work, that he was going to be caught in this hell of endless distortion forever. But then, the sensation of being in multiple places at once faded, and the station around him solidified into a new shape. The figure in front of him vanished, as though it had never been there at all. Jax breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling in short, jagged bursts. The air around him was still, the flickering lights of the station returning to their usual dim glow. He was alone. Or at least, he thought he was, but something was different. The station had changed, its corridors now stretching out in ways they hadn't before. The entire structure felt older, more worn, like it had shifted back in time, like it had been displaced in the fabric of space itself. Jax knew what he had done. He'd used Bernice's system to force a temporal shift, reverting this place to an earlier version, one before it had been tainted. Before the future civilization had begun manipulating it. Bernice? Jax asked, his voice shaky but determined. Status report. Temporal shift successful, Bernice confirmed. However, the anomaly's core is still active. You are now in a timeline prior to the construction of the station, but the anomalies are spreading rapidly. You will need to destroy the core to prevent the collapse of the timeline. Right, Jax said, rubbing his eyes. He felt like he hadn't slept in days. Where's the core? Follow the central corridor, Bernice instructed. It should be located near the heart of the station. Jax moved quickly, his pulse still racing. He didn't know how much time he had before the effects of the shift wore off, before the station began to shift back into its fractured state. The whole place felt unstable now, like it could collapse back into the future at any moment. He ran down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing off the metallic walls. The air was colder now, the once shimmering surface of the station now dull and worn. As he approached the heart of the station, he saw the core, its jagged edges glowing faintly in the darkness, a swirling mass of energy that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of time itself. It was the source of everything. The reason for the anomalies. The reason that reality had been torn apart. Jax didn't hesitate. He pulled out his blaster, aimed at the core, and fired. The explosion was instantaneous. A shockwave of energy shot through the station, distorting everything around him. He was thrown back against the wall, his body slamming into the cold metal. For a moment, everything went black. When he woke up, the station was still there, but it was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the temporal field was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Jax stood up slowly, checking his surroundings. The core was gone. The distortion was gone, but at what cost? Jax took a long breath. He knew the fight wasn't over. The timeline had been reset, but the damage had been done. He had only bought time for humanity to figure out how to stop this from happening again. As he turned to leave the station, the only thought in his mind was one that had been with him since the moment he stepped into the black hole. The future was out there. And he had no idea if humanity could ever stop it.